In the continuation of our studies relating to the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, we're going to talk in this lesson about the concept of immoralism and immorality when we think about the broader concepts of Nietzschean philosophy. And we're doing so, of course, with one eye in mind to looking at the concept of existentialism more broadly. Remember, this is not a series of lessons specifically on just the philosophy of Nietzsche or the philosophy of Kierkegaard. This is a series of lessons looking at how these philosophers are to be interpreted or to have essentially incorporated their philosophy into this broad concept of existentialism. It's a sort of a movement that some of these philosophers even rejected having a close connection and close tie to, but fundamentally is something in which these philosophers exhibit the signs of broader existentialist philosophy. Over the past few lessons, we've spent some time focusing on Nietzsche's most famous contributions to philosophical inquiry. These next two are going to look at the extensions of some of his most famous ideas, as well as some of the more lesser-known contributions to his philosophy. And of course, like I said, we have to do so with keeping in mind the fact that we're talking about not just Nietzsche on his own, but we're talking about that of existentialism more specifically. And I'm going to begin here with this idea of immoralism. And this is something that Nietzsche himself would call himself. He would have, if he is around today, he would have described himself as an immoralist. And at first instance, this might levy one to come to the conclusion that this means that if you are an immoralist, you are somehow anti-morality, or that you do not believe in the existence of, or maybe even the virtue or the practicalities relating to moral systems. Something like, for example, being against this conceptualization of ethics. Well, this is actually not true. It is true that he was something of an immoralist, but this was directed at a particular kind of normative ethical as well as meta-ethical theory. So I've made note of the fact that we've been spending lots of time focusing on quite high-level, advanced, quite niche topics within the philosophy academy, and specifically spending time looking at perception and existentialism, but we haven't spent much time talking about normative ethics or meta-ethics, some of the more bread and butter philosophical ideas. But fundamentally, meta-ethics takes a look at the more metaphysical questions relating to ethics, like what does it mean to call something moral? Where does morality derive itself? Is moral objective or subjective? We have these ideas of cognitivism, of error theories, and non-cognitivism within meta-ethics. And then normative ethics sort of exists a little bit downstream from that of meta-ethics and asks us to derive systems of ethics, systems of thinking that allow us to essentially be able to plug in the applied ethical positions or the applied ethical scenarios, and using our normative ethical theories be able to come out with a conclusion about what ought to be the most ethical system. That's what normative ethics essentially allows us to do. And then one extension from this is that downstream from normative ethics is, of course, you have the applied ethics, where you take normative ethical theories and you apply them to real day-to-day scenarios and situations, like, for example, things like euthanasia or abortion or business ethics or sexual ethics, all of these different kinds of ethical theories and scenarios. More specifically, then, to the normative ethic and the meta-ethics, Nietzsche attacked both Judeo-Christian morality and a type of morality which he described as bourgeois morality. So the common thread between these kinds of different meta and normative ethical systems was the fact that they proclaimed some kind of universal moral principle, some kind of universal moral ideals, okay? So, for example, he rejected this idea. He rejected the concept that there would be some kind of objectivity when it came to the moral truths and standards that we hold to and hold ourselves to. It ruled out both Christian ethics, but also deontological systems. So, for example, the kinds of systems that are supported by the likes of Immanuel Kant, deontological ethics, and even the likes of utilitarianism, things that are some more consequential ethical theories in relation to deriving what is and what isn't the right course of action in moral systems. So, despite the fact that utilitarianism is what we describe as a teleological theory or a consequentialist theory, it deals with the end goal, i.e. the end result, and it is from there that we factor into the ethical considerations of that theory. So for deontology and for sort of Christian ethical systems, you sort of come to the conclusion that something is right and wrong in and of itself, okay? It doesn't matter if it brings about correct actions, it can still be considered immoral. And then utilitarianism is like, well, what is determined to be right or wrong is what brings about the most utility. And the principle of utility is, of course, defined by different philosophers over the years. Bentham believed it to be something akin to hedonism and to pleasure. People like John Stuart Mill made determinations and delineations between what he described as higher pleasures and lower pleasures. You also have things like act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism as well. But fundamentally, all of these things represent something of a consequentialist theory, the idea that an ethical system has to be determined on the basis of the consequences that that decision actually brings. So even though utilitarianism is this sort of consequentialist theory, it would still fall into the critique in the eyes of Nietzsche because it still nevertheless applies universal standards. The principle of utility, while being consequentialist and while essentially changing depending on the consequences of an action, is still nevertheless a universal principle, a principle of utilitarianism. Instead of adopting an ethical system with this kind of universal application, Nietzsche decided to opt for a different kind of normative ethical system, this being the concept of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is something that derives from the philosophy of people like Aristotle. And like Aristotle, Nietzsche sought to ask questions not necessarily about what is universally moral and where universal morality lies, but really the application of principles to oneself. What kind of a person am I? What does it mean for me to be a good person? These are the kinds of ideas that Nietzsche supported when it comes to ethics. And this is a lot more subjective, and it is a lot more down to earth, a lot more philosophically grounded in terms of the ways in which we think about morality from this perspective. It is sort of in conjunction with the virtue ethicist. Of course, the virtue ethicist does take a little bit more into consideration, but fundamentally adopting ethical principles such as virtue ethics, he does come to the conclusion that what is important when it comes to considering ethical theories and when it comes to considering morality isn't what does it mean for something to be moral, or is there this universal moral truth? Is moral truth objective? Are there standards and systems by which we can apply our understanding of morality in a normative sense? Rather, he comes to the conclusion that I just need to ask the question of what kind of a person am I? What does it mean for me to be a good person? Moving on then, in his book Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche actually argues that there are two kinds of perspectives when we talk about morality and when we talk about ethics. We call this the master morality and the slave morality. This is the sort of master-slave dialectical dichotomy that Nietzsche proposes. They would each refer to the structures of ancient society, and specifically looking at ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So when it comes to master morality, this is born out of the masters of the ancient world, and as the name suggests, slave morality derives out of the slaves of the ancient world. What are the characteristics of this sort of dichotomy of the master and the slave in this kind of Nietzschean perspective? Well, according to Nietzsche, the master morality can be characterized as being aristocratic and independent. The idea of morality and goodness is that the individual perspectives of the masters themselves. So it is something akin to how Nietzsche viewed ethics from the perspective of a virtue ethical theory. The idea that we are talking about a quite limited subjective independent perspective in relation to what is and what isn't good and evil. And then by contrast, when it comes to looking at slave morality, we see characteristics which are resentful, which are hateful, and which are reactionary. Okay, the slave will view the virtues of the masters as that of evil. And in that regard, what we see here is a mirror of master and slave. The master's morality is the slave's evil. And by contrast, we see the similar perspective on the flip side. The point that Nietzsche is trying to make when making this determination, when making this delineation between the master and the slave, and looking at the sort of dialectical dichotomy that exists between them, we see that he is trying to make a point about the vast majority of society, given that the vast majority of society, for the vast majority of the time, can be characterized as inhabiting, this view of morality from the slaver's perspective. The idea of vengeful, reactionary, distasteful understandings. When Nietzsche looks to the future, he sees master morality as being the ultimate expression of what he describes as the Übermensch. This is this idea of a higher human being, a greater man or a greater human. Now we will get to the conceptualization of the Übermensch in philosophy later on. Of course, it is quite controversial, a very controversial conception, given that this idea of the Übermensch was transcribed into a Bernard Shaw theatre play on the master and the slave. The man and the Superman is the way in which it is described, and of course it is factored slightly into some of the philosophy of Nazism and fascism. But what Nietzsche describes when he talks about the Übermensch isn't this necessarily suggesting that the Übermensch is some kind of teleological end goal of what humanity should evolve to be like. And we'll get to that in future lessons. It's a little bit more nuanced, his perspective on this view of human nature, and on this view of the ultimate expression of morality.